Our talk today is from Mark Schofield of Plantlife. He's not been in position in his role all that long and has taken over recently, but he's got a lot of insight into verges on a national level. Some of you will be aware of the work the Trust has been doing, and we started getting involved in our local roadside verges 2017, starting to undertake a full survey of roads around the Rins of Islay for flowers and pollinators, producing quite a large report at the end of 2 years in conjunction with the Islay Pollinator Project. We're hoping to develop the work we have been doing, and we have introduced a few trials with the council over the last couple of years, but it's a slow process. But it would be great with having a wider view of how communities are dealing with and councils are dealing with their roadside verges on a wider scale. So I'd like to introduce Mark Schofield, and maybe he can introduce the work that he's doing and give us a broader picture if he's there.
Thank you, Fiona, and good evening, everyone. Hello to you. Yes, thank you ever so much, first of all, for the invitation to join you this evening and to speak on road verges, a subject very close to my heart. And it's a privilege to see that you're so, you have you've taken such an initiative where you are on Islay, and tonight is an opportunity for me, as Fiona says, to introduce Plantlife, the charity, but also to set a UK-wide context for conservation work that's being undertaken, specifically with regard to the road verge network, the public highways infrastructure. But also it's an opportunity for me to really congratulate you as a trust for the huge effort you've gone to assess the biodiversity value of your own road verges as they span the island, and to really start to base some or to generate some ideas on how you can add biodiversity value to your context by understanding what's there and what biodiversity opportunities are possibly present in the road verge network where you are. So what I want to do really is cover some general aspects. Then I'll list a number of case studies, one of which will be Islay, one of which will make reference to the two reports the Trust has published recently. Please understand I haven't had the time to analyze the data to any fine level, but I have had a look at the summaries of what you've concluded from those studies. So it's not a peer review, but it is hopefully an opportunity for me to reflect back some thoughts on what you've been able to summarize and conclude. And hopefully, yes, there'll be time to have a bit of a question and answer session as well, to discuss not only perhaps the findings of your report, but also any ideas that have come from a discussion of the wider context. So I hope that's all good. I'll keep talking. Perhaps Fiona, if you want to interrupt me at any point, you're more than welcome. I might lose sight of you as I present. So do interrupt, or send notes in chat, or relay those that I can't see. But if everyone's happy, I can start to share my screen and share the presentation with you.
Thank you.
And I do still have sight of you, Fiona. If you could give me a thumbs up if you can see the full screen slide. You can, that's great. Wonderful. Great. Well, I should introduce myself first of all, just to add to what Fiona said. So I'm Mark. I'm in my 7th week now with Plantlife, but I do have 13 years of experience working in the road verge environment as an officer with the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust. So it couldn't be a more different context to your own. Lowland, intensive arable farming for the vast majority of the Lincolnshire landscape. And quite often in a context like that, it's really the marginal land, such as linear green infrastructure like road verges, that represents very much more often than not the last stand of semi-natural vegetation, the last stronghold of wildlife, because everything the other side of the hedgerow or the fence has been ploughed up. That's perhaps the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of landscape, when perhaps you might compare it to your own situation. But you can see here a broad drove road, as they're called in Lincolnshire. That's basically a thoroughfare with enough grazing to feed your animals en route to market and back to the fields. So that's the kind of context I'm used to. But certainly, it's been really informative to read your reports of your own verges, and I hope that I can set that in a strategic context tonight. There are only about 65 of us in Plantlife to cover the whole of the UK, so we're spread quite thinly, as you can well imagine. That means that we can't engage at the grassroots level beyond perhaps running large-scale campaigns to generate the political capital to lobby the decision makers in the devolved administrations at Westminster and at local government level too. But then what we are focusing much more on now with our Road Verge campaign is basically working in partnership with professionals in the highways arena, if you like, those service providing industries, the large highways asset service or management service providers, as well as the officers within each of the local authorities, so that those people feel informed, empowered, enabled to make the right decisions to move wildlife in the right direction. We have networks of infrastructure crisscrossing our country, so we live with those, but either side of every grey line are a couple of green ones. So we can also harness the potential for nature, both in terms of sanctuary and connectivity, and more about that in a bit. Just to finish a comment on Plantlife, we have two focuses when it comes to our strategic habitat restoration aims at present. So one focus is what we call temperate rainforests. So those native forests and woodlands very much concentrated towards the north and west with higher rainfall, sporting wonderful lichens, epiphytes, mosses, lower plants, and much underrepresented and much in need of being championed, conserved and restored. And the other focus is grassland. And of course, that crops up everywhere. It's often a Cinderella habitat. It's the bit of land left over that might have some, uncertain ownership. It can form part of the vegetation where it's flanking other land uses. In the case of the highways infrastructures we have, it might be roads and road verges. It could be railway sidings. It's often ditches, dikes and drains as part of drainage systems, flood defence assets too. So really it's often the underdog, and it's often undervalued in terms of what it could do for us in terms of all those ecosystem services and the biodiversity it can support. So road verges are front and centre really when it comes to forming an appreciation of the opportunities for wildlife that grassland in its different contexts can offer. So coming from a conservation context, I have to depress everybody first of all with loads of really dreary statistics, but we've all seen hopefully some headline statistics that make the case for biodiversity, form the conservation rationale, if you like, for why we need to do something rather than nothing when it comes to reversing the precipitous trends of our wildlife. So that State of Nature report, which you may have read, that was last published in 2019, and those horrific statistics you can see there, the percentage of species in decline, the proportion of species at risk of extinction, and the horrific statistic of 97% of wildflower meadows lost since the 1930s, all add up to a call to action, really, to not just halt that rate of decline, but to really make every effort we can to reverse them. And when we focus at road verges, we can, based on our own studies at Plantlife, we found that there are over 700 species of wildflowers you can expect to grow on verges. That's nearly half of the diversity of our flora. Very many of those species are threatened with extinction. And with over 500,000 kilometres of rural road throughout the UK, that adds up to an area which is equal to half of our remaining flower-rich grasslands. So it's a large slice of the pie chart in terms of what's left, and it as a network, it offers a huge potential for a resurgence of that habitat if it's well managed for wildlife. We undertook studies to understand the relative importance for wildlife when it comes to the different habitats that you can find on that linear stretch of ground along our verges. And it turns out that it's the grassy aspects of our verges which offer the greatest potential, the greatest biodiversity value in terms of the sheer diversity of plants, quite often herbaceous perennial plants, and the species, of course, they support as part of the food web many invertebrates to add to that diversity. And if they're flanked with species-rich native hedgerows, then that really is a winning combination, delivers the most number of species, accounts for the highest percentage, the highest proportion of the species richness that road verge habitats can provide. But of course, as you can see in the diagram along the top there, we could always envisage road verges as a set of parallel stripes, if you like, almost a gradient or an ecotone, as ecologists call it, from the road verge edge to the hedgerow or the wall or the field boundary. And there can be lots of different habitat stripes along the way between those two boundaries. Quite often, if I'm interviewed about road verges and it falls to me to make the case for them and illustrate just how much they contribute to our land area, well, I use the government statistics and the statistics provided by a recent investigation using Google Street View. Exeter University determined that 1.2% of the UK's area is actually made up of road verge, and that amounts to some 2,600 square kilometres. So, yes, really, I mean, that's about the size of the English county of Dorset. That might not mean much to you in Islay, but I've just squeezed Islay up there into the top corner of the map, and it's that area of road verges combined is greater than 4 times the size of the island. So that hopefully sets in context the sheer scale that we're dealing with in terms of an opportunity lost if we don't manage it more favourably for wildlife. And as it's all joined up contiguously, it offers, as this diagram tries to convey, connectivity for habitat. Of course, that's really important. Some of you may recall back in 2011, there was a white paper produced, the Natural Environment white paper, which was inspired by the Lawton Review. Professor Sir John Lawton and colleagues from across the conservation organisations, non-governmental organisations, put the case forward that in order to function better, to be more robust and resilient in the face of all the stresses we place upon it, climate change included, invasive species, pollution, increased levels of fertility from surplus to agricultural inputs. Basically, to be more robust, nature needs to be able to recolonize areas that are damaged and seek out new areas to colonize which might be more favorable for it. And in order to do that, it needs to be able to move across a landscape. Not all of our nature is so mobile, can disperse so easily. Many examples of certain species of butterfly and certainly seeds from plants can't cross big divides when those divides might be water or arable cultivation. And so road verges, together with other networks, infrastructure networks, if they're flanked by green infrastructure, roads flanked by ecologically functional and ecologically valuable road verges, then nature can begin to take advantage of that and to disperse as it needs to. And effectively, we have a healthier vascular system for our living landscape. But also, road verges provide ecosystem services. So they provide biodiversity. It's a term that might grate. It's a term you may have heard before. It may have been overused, but we can, in various contexts where roads run through our landscape, the right kind of vegetation growing on our verges prevents soil erosion. It helps to regulate water in the sense that it aids with the right roots and the right vegetation, slows the flow of water, increases percolation, infiltration into the soil. Well, that can help to mitigate the risk of surface flooding across a carriageway, making road networks safer for their users. Of course, it's very important that we capture carbon through plant growth, and that is then drawn down into soil and locked away as organic matter in soils. So yes, it's helping us reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through plant growth if we manage it accordingly. And of course, there are reservoirs of wildlife in our road verges which can act as a source of pollinators to achieve pollination in our crops which require it, and of course to be a reservoir of beneficial insects, the predators, the hoverflies with the carnivorous hoverfly larvae, the carabids, the ground beetles with their carnivorous diet as well, all able to hunt out what could be high abundance of pest species in neighboring land. In order to regulate our air and water and our soil properties, the right soil structures, the right growth of plants can, certainly in urban contexts and areas where there are higher levels of pollution, that can help to intercept air and filter it of its particulates. It can help to intercept the flow of water and filter it of its pollutants. So again, the right vegetation in the context of green infrastructure is so very important. And for many people, in terms of Islay, you have great views wherever you go. But for a lot of people, they might be boxed in by grey, built-up landscapes. And quite often, the only relief from that, from the heat island effects of cities, the only relief from just the glare from the road might be shade from trees. The only relief and shelter provided by hedgerows. Of course, the greenery, that is so important as just being easier on the eye, lowering driver stress levels. It's been found in the scientific literature. It really makes a difference. So, of course, if we have less irate drivers, we have safer drivers, we have reduced rates of road accidents. It all adds up to a healthier and a safer road environment, and it does contribute to our well-being in so many ways. Of course, for a lot of places, it's a tourist's first impression of your landscape, of your neighborhood, and an attractive network of road verges can't hurt, can it, when it comes to boosting your tourist industry. So really, all of those properties, all of those services that our verges can provide, but principally for the purpose of tonight's presentation, what they can do for our biodiversity to help reverse those trends of decline across our landscape. One thing that might look a little far-fetched is that the vegetation that grows on our road verges can provide us with energy, decarbonized energy, to replace fossil fuels. I'll go on to pick up on that theme in a bit. So this is meant to be a diagram that tries to describe what might motivate us to manage road verges, to improve their biodiversity, to enhance their biodiversity, to help them realize their natural biodiversity potential. And this diagram is originally drawn for the English context, but those blue notes and arrows are adding a Scottish flavour. So where I'm talking about the 25-year environment plan and nature recovery networks, Scottish Environment Link have proposed nature networks, which are very much the same thing, envisaging, as I hinted at before with that London Underground diagram of connectivity, a network for nature, reducing fragmentation, defragmenting nature and increasing its connectivity. Where I'm talking about the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act 2006, well, a close parallel to that is the Nature Conservation for Scotland Act 2004, calling on public bodies to keep to their biodiversity duties when maintaining public assets and undertaking public services. Of course, the Scottish Government has a national food waste action plan, and there is now, as I understand it from what I've read, and do put me right if I'm wrong, since January 21, landfilling of biodegradable municipal waste is now banned, and that has implications potentially for what we could do with road verge cuttings. But all of those things combined, the delivery of biodiversity net gain possibly becoming mandated for Scotland as it is now for England, and that precipitating the need for local nature recovery strategies, and with that biodiversity opportunity mapping. You can see how people are starting to really put into action the principles of landscape level thinking, and that the linear networks of green infrastructure are fundamental to this, so that road verge management for biodiversity is now politically attractive. It's part of the strategy for large companies who see themselves as having a corporate civic responsibility, and it's something that we can call on our local and central government to deliver. Plantlife's role is trying to join up what can seem quite disparate dots between highways authorities or local road authorities and waste disposal authorities, and to try to help those who provide public services and those who are contracted to do that, to I think perhaps the best way of putting it is to achieve circular economies, or a circular approach to generating energy and to local economies as well. So hopefully you'll see in some of the case studies how that could be achieved, where in theory the machines that manage your road verges could potentially power themselves by the biomass they harvest. So the Nature Recovery Network, as it's articulated in the 25-year environment plan for England, it imagines 500,000 hectares of additional wildlife habitat in addition to designated sites, more effectively linking existing sites. And when the UK is looked at as a whole, then 50% of that target could be delivered if road verges alone were simply better managed to a sufficient level. So that's the stake that road verge management really has in nature's recovery. So it's worth asking, well, what are the principal pressures on road verge grassland, seeing as that's the most important aspect of road verge habitat for biodiversity? And quite often, cuts are too frequent or too infrequent when we look at things most generally. Greater than 2 cuts per year tends to deny plants and the animals, the insects in particular that depend upon them, the opportunity to complete their life cycles. For example, plants to be able to flower and provide pollen and nectar, to set their seed, to reproduce. And no cuts at all will lead, as ecologists are familiar with, will lead to a process called succession, where if we walk away from plants, the more competitive ones will gradually gain more and more on the less competitive ones year on year, so that what can begin as a species-rich grassland, where everything has a fighting chance, gradually more competitive species like certain coarser grasses start to form tussocks. They outcompete those species around them, leading to a net loss in the diversity of plant species. Scrub or woody species start to encroach, and then the shade-tolerant saplings of trees begin to push their way through the shrubs, and eventually we end up with a woodland. But of course, that assumes that there's no grazing, no mowing. So it's the grazing, the mowing, the disturbance, however frequently, of that habitat that maintains it as an assemblage of herbaceous perennial plants, with a few annuals thrown in, depending on how much you disturb that soil and give them a chance to coexist with the perennials. But there's a sweet spot between more than 2 cuts a year and no cuts a year, and you guessed it, it's about 1 to 2 cuts a year. I'll go on to give a bit more detail on that in a bit. But one thing we find, especially in the lowlands, on richer soils that include a lot more clay with lower rainfall to leach out the nutrients, in other words, in environments which can much more easily accumulate fertility, we find that a smothering mulch of cuttings left behind by a flail mower, which is the most economic single pass way of knocking it all back, I concede. But if you're only passing across with a flail and leaving a thick thatch of growth over the top, then again, that leads to suppression of the less vigorous species, and only the more robust and more vigorous species have the advantage relatively. And so that leads to a net biodiversity loss. Accumulating fertility will result from the rotting down of cuttings that aren't taken away as they would be by wild grazing in a wilder context. And so that rot down of that's left behind after a cut. But also, don't forget, we're adding artificial fertility to our farming systems. Very much more a problem in the lowlands over here in Lincolnshire, where I'm speaking. And of course, that excess nitrogen especially can evaporate, volatilize, and then move in the atmosphere and in a very delocalized way, indiscriminately, rain down with precipitation. And that can affect nature reserves just as much as where it was initially intended. Of course, windborne dust through soil erosion can lead to spreading of phosphates, potassium, etc., in dust particles. So Plantlife has published a report with the title, "We Need to Talk About Nitrogen," because that is having a fundamental effect on the relative abundance of different plant species, conferring an advantage to those that are more competitive and can make use of that unnaturally elevated level of fertility. So we'll see more nettle, more hogweed, more cow parsley, more cleavers, or goosegrass, depending on what its common name is with you, Gallium aperine, up in smothering hedgerows potentially, or taking over on the verge. So it's also worth thinking about the nitrate or the nitrogen content of vehicle exhausts too. All of these forces basically reducing the biodiversity, first of plants, but then secondly as a knock-on effect of the fauna they support. So what are we doing if we're trying to intervene? Are we just gardening, or are we trying to substitute for what would have been a natural influence on grassland systems? We have natural, semi-natural grassland systems at scale in various parts of the world still, where large wild grazing animals maintain them very largely. So we think of wildebeest in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. We can think of the remaining bison in South Dakota in North America, which would have once maintained prairie grassland on a huge scale before it was turned into agriculture. But we would have had our own equivalent, the primordial ancestors of our modern day cattle, the aurochs, the European bison, the ancestors of the horse, the tarpan. These beasts, they didn't see fences, they weren't controlled, they weren't bred by us. So we've invented fences, we've domesticated them, we control how many head of stock are in which land parcel at which time of the year, and so we control vegetation indirectly in that way, of course. And what we have with verges that are enclosed is an opportunity to manage them in a way that potentially tries to simulate wild grazing or brings the same sorts of biodiversity out of those verges which would have resulted from wilder grazing. Open verges, of course, I fully appreciate. We have stock wandering across, very much more the case with you than over here in Lincolnshire. But yes, certainly there are opportunities that vary across a landscape. So not just gardening then. And what we've done as Plantlife is we've worked with a number of partners you can see listed here, and we've produced what is an update to what is grandly titled the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges, which is guidance literature for road management professionals. And what it aims to do is set out a different management approach to improve biodiversity value of verges and actually reduce the long-term management costs of those verges as well. So that's downloadable from our website if you haven't seen it already. That's at plantlife.org.uk, or more specifically from the Road Verges part, which is roadverges.plantlife.org.uk. And inside that guide, we cover areas such as assessment and monitoring, which you're already in Islay very well qualified in. It goes without saying. There's a management section which advises on the general principles behind how to manage verges for best biodiversity effect, options based on different scenarios, and some case studies too to draw on. 5 principles we base our advice on are the regular management, which is essential to maintain the right level of disturbance, the right frequency and intensity of disturbance, which stops a grassy road verge turning into a woodland, or any stage in between, tussocks, scrub, and scattered trees. So the timing is everything when we intervene. Cutting too early will deny plants an opportunity to flower and set seed, and denies early emerging pollinators that have been hibernating over winter their first meal of the season. Also, cutting and collecting. We know it's not always practicable, it's not always economical, and that's quite often the crux of the problem, which my work especially is addressing with biomass collection. More on that in a bit. But where it's possible, then it's very well worthwhile doing, especially in situations where there's higher fertility in the soil. So not always the case in your context. Then managing people's perceptions. Yes, it's quite often the case where I am here in Lincolnshire that the landscape needs to be maintained in a nice and neat kind of way. That's often a sort of a turn of phrase down here. And if something, going by the Lincolnshire parlance is kind of, neither good for use nor ornament, then, it's kind of not worth worrying about. So if you're not growing food on it and it's not pretty, then what's the point? But we can manage road verges in such a way as to enhance the colour they give us, the biodiversity value they have for us. So they are good for use and for ornament. And they're not necessarily destined to become outdoor bowling greens or carpets just to be kept tame, but must be kept safe. It should be made clear. So the power of community buy-in, consulting local people is absolutely paramount. So loads of communication and building quite often an evidence base for what works, and managing and thinking about how risks can be managed is very, very important. So the timing of management is set out in our guide, and there are some options, as you can see there. And I won't go into the detail of them, but you can see that they fall into perhaps 2 categories of: 1, late summer, early autumn cut, and ideally with clearing of the cuttings, or 2 cuts that miss out the central growth season and the peak pollinator activity season as well. Now, obviously, safety is paramount, and all of this needs to be given the caveat that this is all insofar as safety allows. So you could say safety actually should be dictating that grassland is the thing to maintain on a road verge rather than dangerous trees, and that we want to manage the fertility of a road verge downwards so that we manage the growth height downwards over time. That makes sense in the long term because there's less of a need to cut as frequently. So the frequency of cuts can go down if the rate of growth is going down because the fertility is going down. So maybe collection of cuttings or management of the vegetation in such a way, that reduces the height of growth makes sense and is a good investment of effort with a return on that investment in the form of a reduced cost to the reduced use of manpower, kit, machinery, and of course fuel. So this feeds into the answer to the question, why cut and collect? And clippings are removed from the verge to prevent that build-up of a physical barrier to growth through which only the most vigorous plants can punch through. It reduces soil fertility in that you're constantly sponging off that fertility in the form of green and growing material, which has incorporated that fertility from the soil into its biomass. And you're then able to strike a balance. You're able then to prevent the accumulation of fertility that can result from delocalized nitrogen pollution. And then, of course, you're reducing the management burden as regrowth is less. You don't always have to subscribe to taller growth. You can if you manage certain verges, maybe in more municipal, built-up urban and peri-urban areas. If you want lower growth that's neater, well, then you can still have flowers in that, wildflowers which have evolved over tens of millions of years to cope with grazing pressure, and they're the ones that can suffer being mown, but with a collector mower, ideally, perhaps every 6 to 8 weeks rather than every week or 2 weeks. So flowering lawns are an option. And you can frame those taller swards with neat edges so that it's a way of communicating that that's an intentional thing rather than the sign of neglect. No one's walking away from our verges, but they're being, if anything, more conscientious about how they're being managed. This is going to help with issues around being neat and tidy, of people feeling the taxes they pay aren't being spent well. And of course, we can engage communities as you have done and work with local people. And collecting cuttings by raking them up is an awful chore, but there are ways that can achieve that. So that's basically a run through of I'd say the kind of broad scale contexts. And I've got a bit of detail to follow that with some case studies that perhaps contrast your context with my context here in Lincolnshire, some work I've been involved in. And then I'll throw in a little bit of work, really good, really powerful case studies from down in the southwest of England with a very different soil type, but potentially, it has a lot of analogy in many ways. So with a thumbs up from you, Fiona, I'll carry on to the second part of the presentation. Great, I have a thumb. That's wonderful. On with the case studies. And I'll start with yours because Isabel and Fiona sent me 2 reports. The first one that was produced in 2019 based on a study between 2017 and 2018, and then a subsequent report, a phase 2 report. And I'm very impressed. On behalf of Plantlife, I have to say that it is very rare indeed that a community will go to such a coordinated and scientific effort to understand the biodiversity potential of their road verge network, and to then act on that in a way that makes use of that data, turns it into meaningful information, and then goes ahead and trials some activity. Now, I appreciate it's not all been plain sailing, and it can often, studying an environment like road verges can often lead to quite a complex data set. So I appreciate that. As I say, I've not had the opportunity to really burrow into and analyze the data, but I've worked with the summaries of it and the discussion of it and the conclusions you've drawn from it, and they do make sense. So I see that you've seen that there is generally a correlation, a fit between higher growth height and a greater species richness or diversity, loosely using the term, numbers of different kinds of plants, and that grazing, as we would expect, when it's at the right level, and the right intensity has the effect of suppressing grass growth and enabling herbs or broad-leaved perennial herbaceous plants to thrive relatively. So these are good. These are forces for good, in a sense, and also that an adjacent habitat will bleed its biodiversity value into its margins, and road verges will benefit from that. It was good to see that you saw that a higher sward, a higher growth on a verge, basically led to a greater abundance of flower heads as you measured them, flower spikes, flower heads, individual flowers, depending on the species. And that's to be expected, as you said, you yourselves explained, if swards are uncut or ungrazed for most of the season, then that does allow for more flowering and will encourage more pollinator activity. Of course, it makes intuitive sense, and it's borne out through observation. But also, it's important to note that there's a greater species richness or number of different kinds of flowering plant and a greater abundance of flowers and or flower heads, which correlates with pollinator abundance. It makes common sense. And I think where a higher growth height might not work is where we're not mowing sufficiently frequently, and it's leading to competitive species taking over and swamping out the more floriferous or flower producing growth. So a few comments to follow on that, but your general observations are all borne out from review papers in the scientific literature. It was interesting to see that you've got a couple of what are called Schedule 9 species there in the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981, as it also applies to Scotland. Monbretia and Japanese knotweed are they should flash red on your dashboard, and hopefully you've been able to highlight that for the attention of your local authority there to remove those where possible. Pretty though Monbretia is, it can spread like wildfire with those little corms, those little spiral corms, and Japanese knotweed. On a good day, you can even hear it growing. It's ridiculously productive, and it's going to do very well in the more fertile areas because it's evolved to grow from lava fields and to make use of a fertile and uncontested environment. But that's worth noting, I guess. It was also really nice to see wood cranesbill, which I'd expect to see on more base-rich soils. So potentially that's on your brown earths as opposed to your glaze, your podsols, and your peat-based soils. So I'd be interested to know where that occurred. But great to see your orchids appear. That's great to note those. And I note that in your subsequent report, you were able to rescue some of those from the mower to popular acclaim. So you noted that you found some yellow coriodalis. Of course, that's really rare in Scotland. It's non-native, and it comes from the continent. It could well be that that's a garden escape. It has naturalized in the UK. So I'd be interested to know, was that close to habitation, or was it right out in the sticks? Was it close to anywhere where there'd been green waste dumping? So that's an interesting line of inquiry, perhaps. But certainly, I saw that you undertook some useful approaches with regards to maps of sections which fell above a threshold for the number of blooms, however you counted them, per meter, as a measure of pollinator provision. So that's starting to understand ecosystem service provision or pollinator provision, which is great. And then where you saw existing yellow rattle before you subsequently trialed introductions, where there was yellow rattle and where you saw yarrow flowering, just as you theorized, these were good, reliable indications in the vegetation. You're beginning to read the plants like words in the book to tell the story about the land. They were saying that this was where later cutting was undertaken for some period of time. So the land use history, or the land management history, was you could read that in the vegetation. Yellow rattle being annuals, which are easily obliterated through early season mowing or grazing. Of course, they wouldn't be there if any earlier cuts were taken. And similarly, yarrow, although it can spread vegetatively by roots, those feathery little leaves will never pop up that little frothy white multiple daisy flower head, if it's mown before it can produce that. So, and that's a late flowering species. So great use of indicators to try to tell the story about how different verges were being managed. That, of course, informs you in terms of how you might work with local landowners and the local authorities, if they are perhaps the verges mown latest in the year, which could benefit most easily from perhaps introduction of more flowers that would benefit from that and wouldn't be mown away if road verge management couldn't be changed for whatever reason. So those are perhaps the low-hanging fruit verges that you noted in that way. Then there were proposals for future management coming from your first report, ways in which you might try to reduce the abundance of grass. And that makes great sense in grassland management, because in reducing grass, you then allow the species that are outcompeted by the grass to flourish. And these are the flowering insect pollinated plants that give us color, that give us structure, but also give us that broader variety of leaf type, which is great for the larval stages or the caterpillars of our insects. So really good in terms of pollen and nectar provision, but also in terms of providing for the full life cycle of wildlife as well. Targeting minor roads made sense in the sense that you don't necessarily want to attract wildlife to where there's an increased risk of vehicle collision. But I think really we're in, we don't need to worry quite so much where you are. I know things are relative, but where I've been surveying road verges in Lincolnshire, and I've only just grown out my lorry blasted side parting from those kind of vortices of air created by articulated lorries and high speed traffic. I don't think you have as much to worry about where you are for obvious reasons. But I think minor roads can offer greater opportunities, provided they're not used by a higher volume of traffic, which requires more passing, and compaction of the verge. Introduction of yellow rattle as a suppressor of grass is theoretically an option, but that has obviously to be in partnership with everybody involved, and yet more about that in a bit. So additional introductions of seed gathered from local verges. Great that you're thinking about local provenance. Great that you're not going to eBay for your seeds and potentially doing more harm than good by introducing what could be invasive genomes, which could be genetically swamping, if you get my meaning, your existing flora. You need to bring the best out of it, throw a lifeline to it. If things look a little bit weak and feeble, maybe there's some inbreeding going on, but give it a chance before you introduce new things. And really, it would be a tragedy if we took the same seed mix and blanketed the UK with the same one. Let's enjoy our regional varieties and variations. The UK is a real mosaic of soil type and geology, of climate and weather. So let's celebrate, that heterogeneity, and let's respect the way in which even within species there can be a lot of variation, as it's called by geneticists, intra-specific variation, because you can have ecotypes of the same species. A common knapweed growing on wet ground in an acid environment is very different to a common knapweed that might be growing on a high drying calcareous or chalk or limestone rich soil that's free of draining. So by analogy, so many species may have adapted to your local environment, and introduction of seed from somewhere completely different is never going to be as successful. So it's also good to have local reference sites and to make use of seeds collected, perhaps using queues, protocols, so that you don't over-collect and you collect in a way that is representative of the genetic spread, the genetic variation. A rule of thumb there, although I haven't put it in the presentation, is to collect from a minimum of 50 individuals from across a population, perhaps sampled at random, along a length of a verge, so that you have a feel intuitively, but also it's borne out by the science of representing the variation from a population and introducing those ideally by seed rather than by plant for reasons of biosecurity, because that growth medium needs to be sterile, and you don't want to introduce additional fertility or disturbance. Rabbits are very good at locating your pot plants or your plug plants and pulling them out. So seed is often quite a lot more successful in that context. But basically avoidance of early cutting where orchids were present was a suggestion that came out of your first report. You put that into practice, and I think you managed to succeed spectacularly there. Some thoughts that provoked from me was that the proposed species introduction listed white clover. That can be quite invasive. Stick with red. White, maybe in your context in lower fertility scenarios, it perhaps isn't quite aggressive. So I won't challenge that. If your own observations find that Dutch or white clover isn't too invasive wherever it occurs, but it tends to be omitted from seed mixes for that reason. And red clover tends to be the preferred species of clover. Add to that, yes, bird's foot trefoil, especially because of its value as both a nectar source and a food plant for many caterpillars of many different Lepidoptera. Yellow rattle, that tends to prefer to parasitize. I should explain for those not familiar. To use the very scientific terms, yellow rattle, or hay rattle as it's otherwise called, Rhinanthus minor, its scientific name, is what's called a facultative hemiparasite. So to unpick that, it doesn't have to, but what it does, in order to grow well, it has green leaves of its own, which of course photosynthesize, but it also has specialized roots, which grow into the roots of other plants around it and siphon off their vigor, adding to its own. So what you generally tend to find that is this hemiparasite or half parasite reduces the vigor of its target host species all around it. And being an annual, it creates a little gap in the sward when it dies. So if you like, creates a rolling boil, a little gap dynamic, so that there is always a little bit of space for a seed that might be dormant in the seed bank to sprout, germinate, and establish itself in the following growth season. But being a wildflower itself, it adds to pollinator value, but also it reduces the competitiveness of specifically members of the grass family, grasses, and members of the pea family, vetches, vetchlings, and clovers. So what it does tend to avoid, though, it can't parasitize ribwort plantain or oxeye daisy very well, because they've evolved two different mechanisms which stop those specialized yellow rattle roots penetrating theirs. So what you might find is that when you introduce high levels of yellow rattle, you get an unnaturally high level of oxeye daisy if you've introduced that, or ribwort plantain if it's present. You might worry that you're going to annihilate your rarer members of the pea family if you have some rare members of the Fabaceae, as they're known. But I don't think that's an issue given your species lists. It would be an issue if I were to introduce lots and lots of yellow rattle to a verge near me that had some horseshoe vetch on it, and some chalk-hilled blue butterflies were dependent, its caterpillars dependent on that horseshoe vetch, for example. I then wouldn't risk introducing yellow rattle to that context. But in your context, I don't think the parasitism of legumes is an issue, but you may find that an advantage is conferred to certain species until a phytodynamic or a balance between relative plant abundance is finally settles down. Yellow rattle has a habit of moving through vegetation in a wave, but it's easily controlled through grazing and mowing. Yes, surveys of a depth of thatch might be useful. So I don't know whether that was incorporated into your survey plan. I don't think it was. So that's a measure of just how much dead material, fibrous dead material, is in there when you really sort of weeble a finger into that turf, no matter how short it is. Picture the scene when you're at real ground level, really at soil level, and you're trying to punch through that ceiling above you. It's a miniature jungle down there, full of competition. And it might be that there is an opportunity to scarify some verges, to remove thatch, or to potentially see where thatch might be building up, and to ask yourself, would it be worth investing in a change of management that collects the cuttings to prevent a thatch buildup? There have been trials well, you could consider trials of cutting and collecting, where there's most species richness. So if there's a concern that thatch might be working against the existing biodiversity, but you might also think about cutting and collecting where you have the greatest fertility, where fertility appears to have been accumulated. So on your more fertile soils, you might target a trial of cutting with collection. Mentioning soils, I don't know how much of in terms of soil thinking you've incorporated into your local studies. Forgive me if you have done the detail on this, but a quick look at the soil maps of Islay shows that mainly you're looking at a very acid environment, as I'm sure you're well aware, high precipitation levels, and I wouldn't think much of an opportunity for fertility to accumulate. And then if it is present, because of the low pH, that has the effect on a plant's metabolism that fertility, if present, is not so available to the plant for its growth. And that happens either side of neutral neutral pH. But what I'm pointing at here is potentially that where you have, which is clearly the exception to the rule, but where you have brown earths with maybe higher fertility and a higher pH, so more neutral pH, we might expect taller herbs like hogweed to really take off. Now, put me right if I'm wrong. I haven't surveyed these verges myself, but you may be able to shed some light on this. It might just be worth throwing into the debate. And that's where potentially you might have the biggest effect on the safety of your road verges, or the visibility of your pullover zone on approach to tight bends and junctions. If hogweed is towering, it might not be, but if the growth is higher, then that's potentially where you might find that cutting and collecting makes most of a difference. In addition to where there is a fertility input from adjacent land use, especially when that land might be sloping towards verges, and that might be where barley is grown, maybe where there's improved grassland with continued inputs to encourage the grass growth as part of a silage system. So yes, just a thought there. Maybe you can inform your kind of management and your studies with a consideration of soil type. Your phase 2, learn from those lessons, used your data, which is great. And then you trialed some yellow rattle introduction. That seemed to have a significant reduction in the growth height to verges next to improved grassland. So you weren't removing the available fertility for plant growth, but you were hampering the grass's ability to utilize that available fertility. Now, I don't know whether the growth height was measured just for grass, or whether it also factored in taller growing herbs. So I noticed that hogweed, or Heracleum spondylium, its scientific name, it appeared in your species lists, but I'm just not sure how abundant that was, or whether that occurred only in certain localities, and therefore, where nettle and hogweed grows might be quite concentrated. If so, potentially that might be the only real threat to visibility, apart from encroaching scrub. So cutting with collection might not always be necessary, but it might be. It might be in areas where it really matters. It could be focused. There are concerns from adjacent landowners about the introduction of yellow rattle. And from the perspective of Plantlife, we've always maintained that it's really important to consult with local people. And obviously, it's really important to mitigate risks. So I did see some risk planning associated with yellow rattle introduction. And I do hope that there's been a healthy discussion about this. And of course, it's important when we're working with a public infrastructure and a public asset, we strike compromise. We recognize that it's an infrastructure for all to utilize, and that there are always ways in which we can find other solutions potentially to the regulation of plant growth height. And it was very heartening to see that next to unimproved grassland, where there weren't fertility inputs like there might be in improved grassland or in barley growing systems, then we weren't seeing a high growth of vegetation. I'm assuming of just grass and not including hogweed, but a maximum of 20 centimeters is surely not going to impede your visibility as you drive around the island. And it was really good to see to make use of controls in your studies so that you could understand what difference you were really making. So a really good scientific approach to understanding what you could do to intervene, and in this case a biological approach to reducing growth vigor, and finding that perhaps it was only really needs to be targeted at certain stretches where there's higher fertility. Orchids, great to hear that you hugely increased the number of flowering spikes, and that was very popular with local residents. So great to have some champion flagship species really winning the kind of popularity for a project like this. And some thoughts were that yes, consultation and risk mitigation is really important, especially when it comes to that yellow rattle introduction. It seems to be most acceptable and effective, the yellow rattle, next to improved grassland, where non-target effects of applied fertility can be counteracted without necessarily having to collect the cuttings, but potentially. Public support for flagship species like orchids are so important, and it's great that has featured already as a response to your good work. Risk management can accommodate later and or fewer cuts where growth is found to be below a maximum height. And that, if it's never really going to grow too high, then let's think about cost savings and concordant biodiversity gains. It was wonderful to see grass of Parnassus in some of your photos and on some of your verges recorded. And yes, potentially from the kind of species assemblages you were reporting, Mulreach and Portnahaven, forgive me if I've mispronounced them, they look like they could be, target assemblages for, examples to really achieve elsewhere in your road verge network on similar soils. Let's be fair, you can't, make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. So, potentially where there's similar soil types, you might aim for that. And those verges might be a seed source if seed is taken judiciously and not over harvested to damage the existing population. But they could be a seed source for future restoration elsewhere. Green hay doesn't always take the snapshot you want, and sometimes there's no substitute for hand harvesting and careful introduction. Some comments on that. You may or may not be well aware of the wonderful local population that the Rins of Islay support in terms of the marsh fritillary local form, Scotica, Euphydryas aurelia form Scotica, it makes a stronghold for itself on your island. And of course, its caterpillars will really only eat the leaves of devil's bit scabious. Yes, desperate circumstances, they'll feed on honeysuckle, but that's a woodland plant. So really, in a more open habitat, it's really devil's bit scabious or nothing. And for the nectaring adults, ragged robin and tormentil are really good nectar sources on your soil types. So I would say, if you really want to boost the connectivity of the habitat for this really important Lepidopteran species on your patch, then you can throw it a lifeline. I noticed that the instance of where the instances where devil's bit scabious, ragged robin, and tormentil, for that matter, were recorded were fewer and further between than other species. So potentially these species are seed limited, and they could be good target species to hand gather seed from and to seed into suitable soil type, so that potentially you can create corridors of connectivity for this habitat that will make use of those corridors if it has a chance. Then the grayling, great to see at least one record of grayling in your invertebrate surveys. That's a grass feeder in its caterpillar stage. Bristle bent and red fescue are the grasses that would occur on your more acid soil types. So these are these are grass species that will benefit from less vigorous grass growth. If fertility accumulates and there's less cutting or mowing or grazing of the verge, then more invasive more vigorous, coarser growing grasses will invade and push these out. So maintaining a sufficient level of disturbance, a sufficient frequency of mowing is important for grayling. But then it needs, as an adult, nectar sources in the form of red clover and bird's foot trefoil mainly. So encouraging those species is really important too. And the subspecies, Atlantica, has a stronghold precisely where you are. That's with that more contrasting, brighter orange underneath the forewing there. So whatever you can do for your grayling along those lines on your road verges, and indeed on neighbouring land, even just around the margins, would be absolutely wonderful. Then dark green fritillary, great to see records for that on your patch, and encouraging common dog violet for the larvae would be important. That, of course, when it grows, it doesn't want to be swamped already by last year's growth that wasn't cut down or grazed away. So it needs a short sward in spring. And so where you do have your dark green fritillary, do try to make sure you've got a nice short sward to start the growth season. And yes, do encourage the common knapweed, the clovers, for nectar sources when it's on the wing. So hopefully that's done a bit of detail. Hopefully, that's added some value. Hopefully my comments there are helpful in some ways in response to your good work and your trials following your initial studies. And as I say, yours is a rare level of effort that you've gone to, which is commendable. And I hope that that's been popular in the round, and that any disputes have been resolved and can be managed through proper risk planning. Over on my patch, then, as I'll round off now. I appreciate I've reached the hour, so I'll progress at pace. Yes, in Lincolnshire, we have a roadside nature reserve network of some 80 kilometres. We cut and collect the hay with subcontractors, including local farmers, and that's managed by the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust, for whom I used to work. So there's an annual budget, as you can see there, for optimal management of the very best verges, which comes to about just over £150 per kilometre of verge. But that's not really enough to get the best out of those verges. It could be more. So that gives you a ballpark figure. Haymaking is made between mid-July and the end of September, followed by a flail in the autumn, where we get more vigorous growth, and that's to keep at bay more vigorous growth, as I say, and to enable good, uncontested, less competitive start to the growing season. What you're seeing there are a range of pedestrian power units, which can be used on the less accessible verges. And if you want more information on those, I'm happy to give them. But there's a potential solution we've been investigating in Lincolnshire, which looks at harvesting the biomass from verges and then trying our best to simulate the natural process of wild grazing, which would be to remove those cuttings, but then put them into an artificial stomach, if you like, trying to simulate, a wildebeest, a tarpan, a bison, or an oryx. Anaerobic digestion is a way to extract some value from these grass cuttings by generating decarbonized, i.e. not fossil fuel sourced, heat and power. So what feeds into that is an opportunity created here in England, where under the Environment Act as it applies to England, there will be a legal requirement to eliminate rotting or putrescible waste from landfill by 2030, to stop the methane leaking from landfill sites into the atmosphere, methane being an even worse greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. That's leading to, over here, a separate household food waste collection from about next year. The local authorities have been briefed on this, and central government is calling for it. Now, do put me right if I'm wrong, but I believe since 2021, that's been a requirement already in Scotland. So this potentially it makes us think of what's called the waste hierarchy, where, as you can see here, waste disposal authorities or local authorities in their capacity and with regard to their responsibilities for securing the right environmental fate for organic wastes, well, they are encouraged to think about, firstly, preventing the production of this waste, but where you are producing it because you're having to manage a safe road environment and mow it, well, you could let it rot in place. But if you're delivering to your biodiversity duties, then you really ought to, if the accumulating fertility is a problem or the thatch is a problem, then collecting your cuttings would be a solution. But where do you put those darned, cuttings? And it's more trouble than it's worth, and it costs an awful lot to go and transport them and take them somewhere else. So what if you put them into anaerobic digestion? That is a way of getting more value out of them than simply incinerating. So that can be explained. That's a separate presentation. But you have to ask yourself, could any food or garden waste be used as a feedstock for an anaerobic digester? And if not, can it be composted? And then there are ways in which all of that can, as you can see here, generate compressed natural gas from biomethane, not from fossil fuels. That can be a fuel mix or a fuel replacement for diesel for large and small vehicles. You produce heat on site because there's bacterial activity that can be utilized. There's power too. If you burn the methane to generate steam to drive a turbine to sell that electricity to the grid. So you do need a waste permit. So it does make more sense if you are a larger facility rather than an on-farm scale, let's say 500 kilowatt operation. If you're larger, it does make sense. So, but there are options for on-farm biodigestion as well. So I should ask, we asked in our studies, well, when and how do you mow a verge? This corroborates the advice given by Plantlife. And when I was working with Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust, I came upon this review paper. I can send you a link to the paper itself if some of you there are interested. But Jacobsen was the lead author of a paper published in 2018, and you may well have read it. But across 54 studies across Europe and North America, the conclusions of how to mow a verge for best biodiversity results were that for the sake of plants and plant diversity, it's better to mow rather than not mow, to mow each year, and ideally to mow twice a year rather than not at all, and rather than once a year in many cases, and to remove the cuttings when you do cut. So cut twice, remove the cuttings when you do, seems to be a very general rule of thumb, what's required across the vast majority of sites. That does address fertility issues. So it may be that if you have a naturally less fertile environment, you can get away with one cut and not always collecting your cuttings. But there wasn't enough data for a quantitative analysis of the effects on invertebrates. So we drew our own conclusions from that. And we started to think about how we could benefit wildlife by creating a linear mosaic where the verges are wider, perhaps cutting with decreasing frequency as you go towards the back verge from the road, leaving an interval between mows of some 10 to 12 weeks in the height of summer, which is peak pollinator activity and regrowth and reflowering and production of seed for plants. And that you see again in our mowing calendar produced by Plantlife's published guidance. Then perhaps a suction flail that you might use for a single pass biomass harvest might do more harm than good on a species rich verge, but maybe that would be better suited to species poor verges to bring them up to a good baseline background level. And we might consider carrying, not rolling the flail on the back verges where we might not want to disturb species like the kind of ground dwelling invertebrates, but also vertebrates like amphibians, reptiles, hedgehogs, maybe, if you have any where you are there, you don't run away, or could be run over. So ground nesting birds tends not to be such an issue on verges because they have plenty of other options, especially in your kind of landscape. So we wouldn't expect ground nesting birds to be disturbed, but you can have certain cutting heads with an agitator up front and set at a height without a roller so that you can pass over most things that would be vulnerable. And we found that when you think about how much energy you can get back for the energy you put in, the biomass and its energy value for the energy you put in which could be the diesel you're burning to go and get it, or it could be the biogas that you produced from last year's cuttings that's driving your machine. More about that in a bit. Then, yes, we could say that there's a sweet spot. Just 2 cuts a year from an unfertilized system, and that's where you're self-regulating. More than 2 cuts would be bad for biodiversity. 2 cuts is about right for both biodiversity and energy recovery. So that was worth bearing in mind. There are risks of a suction flail that we found. There'd be damage to invertebrate populations. We'd be removing seeds, and we'd be simplifying the structure of vegetation. We could even drive a market for more intensive management of road verges. So it would be important to make sure that sweet spot works, that people don't try to fertilize verges and treat them like silage crops, or they would become silage crops and not diverse grassland habitat. So yes, there's not really the resources within local authorities to regulate the private sector. So instead, we need to make sure that part of the ethos, service delivery, net zero and biodiversity targets for service providing private sector companies would embody the a self-regulating approach. And how can we mitigate that risk? Well, a clear map of verge quality is so important to understand where you shouldn't suction flail, or where you shouldn't manage too intensively, and potentially where you could, in order to create an uplift in biodiversity value. So you've started to map your own verge quality, as we did in Lincolnshire. We'd then be in a position to optimize management of the best verges, and to then, I suppose you could say, mainstream better management for the rest. We could rotate the management of what we could call sanctuary strips, sections of the back verge we didn't mow every year, but perhaps every other year, adopting a convention that would be easy to follow. And we might be able to monetize biodiversity through habitat banking, or there might be ways to offset development. But I appreciate that's not really going to be a principal driver in your context. So road verge surveys over in Lincolnshire then involved a large-scale citizen science project over 6 survey seasons. And to cut a long story short, we managed to cover about 1/3 of Lincolnshire, predominantly targeting the chalk and the limestone areas, so that we'd be looking at the naturally higher levels of biodiversity or floral species richness. And that led to the designation of a large number of local wildlife sites, local classifications for conservation within our county. And that data was fed into a GIS reporting facility, very important to inform the local utilities companies and the local authority, and flag areas that would be vulnerable and needed more sensitive management, especially if you're digging up the road for whatever infrastructure. Forgive the duplications. Oops. And there we are. So here we have an insight into our website, where we used at the time in 2009 Google Maps and Google Maps Street View. We coordinated surveys for volunteers so that they could effectively claim their own verge, download survey form and survey guidelines and their own Google Maps view of their verge and a location for it. And so surveyors were able to manage themselves to a large extent. We were then able to revisit those verges that surveyors found contained more than a threshold level of indicator species that we listed in our ID guides. So we listed good guys and bad, and that was a way of saying these are good species which are reliably associated with a lot more biodiversity, and therefore act like a tip of the biodiversity iceberg, if you like. And these are the bad guys, which indicate that management could be more sympathetic to road verge grassland biodiversity. And so on that basis, we were able to gain an impression of condition as well as diversity. We built up a map showing different categories of quality, and that became part of a biodiversity opportunity mapping study for an area known as Central Lincolnshire. So you can see some interesting patterns started to emerge on the left-hand map there. You can see how the highest scoring verges, roadside nature reserves shown in purple, RNRs, you can perhaps see an inverted Y shape standing out in the data there, and those are Roman roads. So I appreciate Roman roads didn't quite reach you, but where we have ours, then they've turned out to be really good, broad verged potential corridors for wildlife. And there may be an analogy on your patch. You may find that certain categories of road or certain stretches are acting like the spine, maybe, for the island, whereas the rest might be the ribs when we're thinking about that kind of structure of connectivity. When we distilled the summary from that data, we found that it's really only the top 1% of verges that represent the very best. And they might be the ones that need treating with special investment of machines, budget, skill. Then the silver podium, silver medal winners are perhaps the next sort of 10% in terms of the proportion of verges. And they might be really restorable. They might be the low-hanging fruit. If you improve your management there, you get the quickest wins, maybe over the shortest period of time. That 90% approximately of not particularly outstanding, quite rubbish verges in terms of floral diversity. Well, maybe they're best for structure, offering vegetation structure, but maybe they could be mown more aggressively with cutting and collecting, potentially undergoing a restorative phase of cutting potentially up to 3 times a year with cutting and collection to reduce the fertility, but perhaps not all at once, and perhaps on rotation. So we have an idea there about the vast majority of our network perhaps being a good source of biomass, which is a way of funding our verge management. You can see how if you do undertake 2 cuts for biomass harvesting, we're even countenancing a May cut, which we wouldn't normally advocate in a scenario that's designed to maximize biodiversity. But in those lower scoring verges, we're still giving a 12-week regrowth window period, which is skipping the peak pollinator activity. So that regrowth, reflowering, seed production, and peak invertebrate activity is still spared. And linear mosaic cutting there is illustrated in that way, with a decreasing frequency of mowing from the road edge to the back verge, really only applicable to broader verges, as you might find here in Lincolnshire. But I appreciate you may have broader verges of your own. And in practice, that's what it might look like, where you have a frequently mown, safe pullover edge. You have a sweet stripe in the middle, like a long, thin hay meadow. And then you might have a more structural and less frequently mown hedgerow base, for example, or field margin, which has the taller growing herb assemblage. Whizzing through the next bit, well, we were inspired by work in Montgomeryshire, which found it could collect cuttings usable for anaerobic digestion at over more than 10 tons of fresh weight per hectare. They didn't investigate the economics, so we did. And we borrowed a machine from the Belgians in 2016, and we found that it chemically, in terms of potential contaminants, but also in terms of all the other factors that could affect anaerobic digestion, all of those properties were favorable for anaerobic digestion. And tantalizingly, the cost, it cost us, what it cost us to achieve that harvest was below the value for the grass that might be paid by an anaerobic digestion operator who wanted to use it as fuel, hinting that we might be able to cover our operating costs for cutting the verges and may even make a profit. So we engineered our own version in 2018. We even got onto Countryfile for our trouble, and we cobbled together a customized trailer, coupling, suction flail system to an existing tractor, and we managed to achieve a pretty good harvesting rate and forward speed. And all of that made great sense. We even managed to, as the green line for our cuttings compared to the yellow line for maize, on the vertical axis, it's methane yield against time on the horizontal axis. You can see how our green grass cuttings yielded more rapidly and more in total in terms of biomethane versus a purpose-grown energy crop. So we're in the running to really, if not replace, augment energy crops, and thereby by utilizing marginal land take the pressure off food producing land for biomass and bioenergy production. Lots and lots of companies, whether they're local councils or whether they're logistics companies, are using compressed natural gas that's come from biomethane from anaerobic digestion facilities, and they are finding that they can massively reduce their carbon dioxide and their particulates as a result, and also the costs of running their fleet. And as of 2019, methane power is now available to tractors, to the T6 methane powered model of New Holland tractor. And along with that comes all those benefits you see listed there in terms of running cost, reduction of CO2 emissions, and far fewer particulates. Not much time left, I appreciate. So what I will say is that those of you who've been involved in surveying your verges, you're very welcome to talk to me about survey methodologies that we've produced in Lincoln and ways in Lincolnshire, and which take account of what can often be the case, a gradient of fertility, of salinity, of vegetation disturbance that decreases in terms of salinity and disturbance towards the back verge away from the road, but can often increase in fertility going towards the back verge if there's an adjacent intensive agricultural usage adjacent to the verge. But you can see here we're using lines of quadrats or grad sects, which take a look with controls at plant growth and species diversity and species richness. And you can see here how that's trying to take account of the fact that when you go across any one verge, we found that might be very much less the case where you are, but on our soils, in our context of intensively farmed landscape, we found that there was a very different vegetation assemblage between the road verge edge, the road verge middle, and the road verge back, and there was more variation across any one verge than there would be between similar strips on different verges, if you take my meaning. So capturing that and not just throwing a quadrat at random into a verge, because you get more noise than you would get signal in the data set. So happy to talk about that in detail if that's of use to you. But just going to show how potentially we had our own kinds of challenge and our own kind of context. Coming to the end now on Dorset, they found that they were cutting and collecting with smaller scale equipment. This is a Grillo machine. Also, the Amazon Profi Hopper is another great machine. It can get into the nooks and crannies. And here the staff were tasked with find somewhere to dump the cuttings within the road verge system. That simplifies things when you don't need to then treat the material you've harvested as a waste and have a waste carrier's license to take it somewhere else. And you can see here how every so often there'd be a sacrificial area that you could treat as a rock down zone, and it's stimulating natural grazing, because natural grazing and to an extent less intensive domesticated livestock grazing does exactly the same thing, in that stock or wild animals will graze, they'll remove biomass, they'll create a churn, a rolling boil in that grassland system, which gives everything a fighting chance, different stands, different kinds of structure, and little scuffs and poachings and closer croppings here and there. But then stock can be corralled or will seek shelter and defecate preferentially in certain areas, or avoid grazing in areas where they have recently defecated, so that you end up with a mosaic of fertility. Fertility is redistributed within a grassland system, and you have low and high fertility, more and less disturbed, where you would have previously otherwise have had the same conditions throughout and no disturbance. So what we're doing is we're perhaps trying to be an aurochs in a different kind of way here, with a highly evolved piece of cut and collect machinery. So these are obviously hireable and trialable, and Dorset has made a good success of those. So if you wanted to talk to people in Dorset County Council, you definitely could. There's a great little YouTube video here, and I can send this on, as a link. The Wales Biodiversity Partnership quite impartially demonstrates in that video different kinds of machine. So it's not a hard sell in any case. It's just a way of illustrating what's out there in the market, which if you could get sent to you, you could apply potentially on your verges. And in terms of road construction, and I appreciate there aren't any major bypasses you might be planning in the foreseeable future, but it goes to illustrate just how dramatic the results can be if you depart from the cultural norm, the cultural default within the road construction industry of shaping the land and then greening it up nicely with lots of rich topsoil, highly fertile soil, and then sowing it with amenity, squeaky green perennial ryegrass, and all of that a good job. Well, of course, what you've just done in adding that topsoil, increasing that fertility, and sowing that rapidly growing grass, yes, you've created a uniform green carpet, which suits one aesthetic. Yes, it's the kind of grass that heals itself whenever it gets scuffed. It covers the ground well, so it defends well against kind of rainfall, heavy rainfall. You won't have gully and rill erosion forming because that fibrous network of roots of grasses is holding onto the ground really well. But what it's doing is it's chaining you to an oar that you're going to have to pull on for years to come, which is going to cost you, your kit, your people, so much more than you would otherwise have to pay. Why not manage out that maintenance and not add topsoil, or add the barest minimum of topsoil, as you can see here? And after 10 years, the Weymouth Relief Road still wasn't needing much management at all. No mowing, occasional grazing, but that was it. And very much more often than not, nothing at all. And starting with oceans of kidney vetch, a little yellow flowering member of the pea family, and the food plant for the small blue butterfly. That started, and that was in high abundance. But then after 10 years, a natural succession took place. It never turned into scrub. It never turned into tussocks or anything vigorous or tall. Instead, all you had were lower than knee-height pyramidal orchids in high abundance. What a reward for less effort. So that's a great case study for keeping the fertility down in a system. And as you can see here, big savings were achieved as a result of simply not just painting by numbers, but thinking first about the ecology. And of course, when we talk about an engineering solution that can be provided by the ecologists, well, the engineers need to listen to ecologists when it comes to not just creating that fibrous mat that's very superficial, made of grass and grass roots, but pinning that mat more deeply into the soil to anchor it to the soil and through the soil profiles, so that you don't have, with high rainfall and saturation of the soil, any rotational slip or any movement on a shear plane as one soil horizon saturates and another stays firm. So you have the opportunity to introduce deeper rooting herbs that are much better for the soil structure, increase percolation, infiltration, and basically increase the soil landform integrity, which forms part of a civil engineering solution. Of course, fuel requirements were quantified here by ADAS, and the greenhouse gas emission reduction you can see very clearly in this bar chart when we compare the standard against low topsoil. So the emissions from topsoil systems, where topsoil is added, are the first two bars. The third barely visible bar is with low topsoil. Vastly reduced emissions by 97% of greenhouse gases as a result of simply not adding topsoil, because you didn't have to put it there in the first place, and you weren't then trying to cope with the vegetation that grew as a result of that additional fertility. So Plantlife's vision for verges, to finish off then, is to achieve optimal management for the best verges wherever they are, so they can shine and be the best they can be. Mainstreaming better management for the rest of the verge system, so that it can provide the connectivity between the best parts, act as the arteries, if you like, in the system, and then ensure the survival and the spread of both the common and the rare species for their own sake, for environmental benefits, and to enhance our contact with nature, because road verges are what we see when we move through our landscape on the way to work, on the school run, and hopefully working together That's conservationists with civil engineers, with local authorities, with local communities. We can raise that bar together. And then we're very keen to showcase and celebrate progress, people's successes, yours among those, working with councillors, highways teams, contractors, volunteer groups. We can't work directly on the ground everywhere, but what we can do is shine a light on your success and continue to build a knowledge base and signpost successes, just as I'm doing here, really, but also really to start to work strategically, as I'm also doing, by infiltrating conferences and professional associations. So I give presentations very much like this to highways professionals and to landscape asset management service provider, big companies, waste disposal authorities and their service providers, so that we can start to join up the dots between waste management and highways management. And hopefully then local authorities will begin to manage their budgets between departments, and they can see that potentially costs to one are big savings to another. And so if the balance sheet spans more than one division within a local government, overall they're better off, and so is the public. So roadverges.plantlife.org.uk is a great source of one-stop shop information for people who want to do their bit for wildlife on their patch, and challenges the standard ways of working, and hopefully could help to empower people to create that systemic change in road verge management. And you're more than welcome to get back in touch with us via this email that's on screen now. Thank you very much for your time and your interest this evening. If there's time, if people want to stay on a little bit longer, then I'm more than happy to linger on and to answer any questions you might have. Am I still sharing? And would you need me to stop sharing?
You're still sharing just now.
Great. Okay. I'm wondering then. Yes, if I stop my video and then I'll try to stop sharing. Are you then seeing just my call sign?
We're still seeing your share screen. If you can somehow stop the share.
Yes, I had a problem with that before, and I'm not sure whether I can, based on the options I've got on screen, which is a bit frustrating. So yeah, I could leave a holding slide there. So if you're seeing, are you seeing the slide there in full screen?
Yes.
Hopefully you're just seeing that. That's easier on the eye than the slide sort of view. Okay.
Right. Thank you very much.
I think I can maybe stop it.
Yeah, if you could cancel it as master controller, David. See if you can boot off my slideshow.
Possibly. Maybe I can do that.
I've got end slideshow, and then display settings are lost to me when I do that. So I might do well to defer to your control on that.
No, stop
Okay.
yeah, I've done it. I've killed you.
You've done it. Oh, great! You've killed me. Brilliant. Great.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that very in-depth view of how the verges are treated elsewhere as well. There's lots of nice ideas and thoughts for what might, be able to adapt in, or maybe persuade the council to adapt into their thought processes. We are very much limited to what the council's prepared to do, which at the moment is generally they have one cut and can only manage 1 meter's worth of verge cut per year, and it's timetabled to when they can bring the equipment over from the mainland. So yeah, it's very restricted what we might be able to achieve, but I'll try and keep them interested and see what we can.
Sure. I mean, I mean, shipping over an Amazon Profi hopper, for example, not on commission, but it's a very versatile bit of kit, and it might work within the curtilage of your towns and villages. It might work on certain stretches where you target its use, and it's a good all-rounder. And things like it too, in that it has a reasonable capacity to hold on to what you cut if you're collecting, and then it has a high tip facility, so that can go into the back of an accompanying trailer. and so you can see how that would work. But your information, the maps you have potentially inform where that could be focused to best effect. So this is great in terms of, you've done what a local authority would find incredibly expensive to do. You've put boots on the ground, and but those boots have been transporting ecological brains around as well, which is great. And you've thought through the scenario. You've kind of worked the problem, so to speak. And I guess first and foremost, you found the most precious verges, and to have Grassa parnassus growing on verges is wonderful. Excuse me.
It's quite common.
Yeah, but we saw our last Grassa parnassus in Lincolnshire, decades ago. But yeah, I mean, that's a great speciality for you guys. But of course, excuse me, you might find that if you increased your ragged robin and your tormentil, and your devil's bit scabious, those butterflies that are that would benefit most from those species would flourish all the more. So it's great
these verges are kind of overflows of what's in the natural environment adjoining. So it's where you've got acid kind of peatland, and which become part of the verge. And these have been all the ones that are most species rich for the most part.
Great. And I guess it's worth, to put things in a really crude context, you could say that, verges or a road system with its accompanying verges could, in one landscape context, be a whole load of black lines on a green background, because they are dividing up a really nice habitat. They're creating barriers to the movement of wildlife. Where they're built, and the effects that traffic have on the immediate environment is negative on a good background of wildlife. But conversely, you might find that in a context where the background level of wildlife or biodiversity is that much lower, they could be green lines on a black background. So the green lines on a black background scenario is perhaps more descriptive of Lincolnshire's predicament, where we're necessarily the breadbasket of the UK to a large extent. We cultivate a lot of our soil, and possibly the last bit of ground that isn't cultivated or fertilized can often be a road verge. Within a national park or within a context like yours, there could be already a very high background level in the matrix of biodiversity. So it's worth asking, what can verges add to the landscape that the rest of your your landscape doesn't already provide? And if it's a key connector for a certain element, then it might be worth playing to that strength. So it could be vegetation structure. It could be certain things that you only find on road verges because there's already plenty of the rest elsewhere. So yeah, don't let road verges and their optimization for a certain kind of habitat get in the way of maybe a complementarity. They might be able to provide something that elsewhere you don't have. But similarly, I wouldn't advocate introduced non-native species. I wouldn't advocate working with or trying to skew the vegetation into a non-natural state any more than it already is.
No, there's always been the main aim to know what's there and not just complement what's there originally. And it's been the surveys have been very good, and thanks to the Botanist Foundation for all their funding that's enabled that to happen. So it's a great bit of work to know exactly what's there, and that's the whole point of what we tried to achieve. So,
I mean, if there are no questions, but please fire them if you have. I would say that really this. Please be encouraged that you're doing all the right things in sort of finding out what's there first. And I think the kind of citizen science that we did in Lincolnshire is I guess it's one example of how you can gather that information. What you've done on your patch is another example. These examples should really be encouraging the rest of the UK. Frankly, it's I think what you've achieved there is really, really useful information, which is hopefully the evidence base that can influence the decision makers and the funders as you see them, as you identify them. And the challenge now is communicating what you feel are the ways you can maximize, capitalize on your road verge infrastructure, your biodiversity asset that's part of that infrastructure, that green infrastructure. I found, as you can see, with the slides I've used, that it's important to try to understand the political drivers and the legislation that's applying, to the devolved administrations. And there's Nature Scotland and Scotland Nature Link. That's really, really important in terms of using the words and the arguments already formulated and signed up to by a consortium, a partnership of ENGOs, as we call ourselves, environmental non-governmental organizations. So yeah, really just if you already use the tools that have been forged already by ecologists who've been sort of addressing these issues, and the Scottish Environment Link and their nature network concept is hopefully a string to your bow.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Hey, can I just chip in?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just enjoyed that very much. It's nice to actually hear good environmental news. I mean, we live in a world of doom and gloom at the moment. It tends to be all, it's this and all that and all that, and blah, 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 and all this stuff. But yeah, I enjoyed tonight. It was very good. I apologize that I didn't promote it enough. I'm representing the Botanist Foundation as well as INHT tonight. I'm glad we're recording it, because I will then send a link to my fellow trustees on the Botanist Foundation board.
Please
encourage them to look at it, and because it does, you've given a very good critique of Fiona's excellent work. That's mainly Fiona, but she's been supported by other people as well, and the foundation are very pleased with what Fiona's produced. It adds a lot to our knowledge of Isla's biodiversity, and the Botanist Foundation and its foraging activities for gin. Certainly very grateful to the work that Fiona does. So there's a practical spin-off to it as well. And yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, verges are very important in Lincolnshire, and I can sense that people on either think, well, there's plenty of other stuff, and why do you need to worry about a few meters on the side of the road when there's a ton of other good biodiversity anyway? But biodiversity is always under threat, even in relatively remote places like Islay. There's still even in the years I've been there, the sort of increase in agricultural mechanization, where it used to be quite low tech. There's a lot of more high tech. There's a lot more getting to the edge of the fields with the ploughing. It's encroaching all the time. So it's important that, I know we do have an island. We have lots of concrete margins and other sorts of biodiversity improvement initiatives going on, but we shouldn't lose sight of the verges. They are important, and they're visible as well. They're not just sort of hiding away.
That's great.
So that's one point. Probably I had other points I wanted to make, but I've probably forgotten them all. Thatch and sort of removing cuttings is an interesting thing. I cut my lawn with a mulching mower. Is that better or worse? I mean, I know it's leaving the cuttings in, but it doesn't cover the grass in the sense that the thatch does. Is mulching better than just leaving the cuttings?
Yes. So short answer, basically, yeah. What you don't want to do is present a physical impediment to regrowth, because that's going to filter the growth that can come through and lead to biodiversity net loss. Double chop mulching, with a mulching deck, that's great if you want to leave the shortest strand possible that can decompose quickly and not present a physical barrier. But you've then limited yourself, as far as I understand, lawnmower engineering, because mulching decks they tend to require a short sward to start with. They can't really tackle a tall sward.
Yeah, well, that's my issue. When I cut my grass, but I have it set to mulching, and as long as it's not too long, it tackles it okay. Mm-hmm. But I started removing the cuttings, thinking, well, that will decrease fertility and increase the amount of plants and diversity I sowed my lawn grass with a seed mixture, with a flower mixture.
Great.
I'm talking my own garden. I mean, I'm talking about my quarter of an acre of Islay. I'm just interested in how to manage it.
Yeah. Well, I've done the same. I've created a flowering lawn. So I even went to a reputable seed supplier, and I think close to you might be Scotia Seeds, for example. Again, I'm not on commission, but the idea that the ethos they espouse is, local or at least UK provenance, and that's moderated carefully for all the reasons I've given before. Mm-hmm. Really, they should be able to provide you with flowering lawn mix. Yes, grasses to sort of fill up the matrix and suppress the weedy species, but then to complement that, the grazing resistant or mowing resistant species. So earlier in the season, you might find some violet, and that's unlikely, but very probably something like cowslip that can flower before your first mow, and then ground ivy is also a really good early flower. But then getting into birdsfoot trefoils and red clovers, for mid-season, I've augmented that with a little bit of black medic, but I appreciate that's not so happy on acid soil. But then I guess you can hold out for self-heal and yarrow later in the season. You can have semi-shade tolerant species like bugle, for example. But the trick here is you can mow potentially about 3 or 4 times in the year with a collector mow, and then the reflowering is really good. So you can maintain a short carpet effect. You can use a mower that can only handle shorter swards. But if you collect those cuttings, then you can maintain, as we have out here, and even under and around play equipment. I can mow, access paths, picnic bays, little clearance areas under my daughter's swings or trampoline, that kind of thing. Then, you can at least frame your functional space with, shorter mowing, or with a flowering lawn. And even the hedgerow bases you can leave unmown even over winter, if you can suffer 1 or 2 foot margin of stems that stand over winter. But that's going to mean your small skipper butterflies can curl up those grass blades and survive a winter, or things can hibernate inside the stem of a hogweed over winter. So it's where it's not unsightly, where it doesn't look neglected, where you can complement it with different, you can step outwards and upwards.
That is the biggest challenge, isn't it? It's about aesthetics, and it doesn't look neat. We have the same issue. I live in half in Glasgow, and we have an issue with the council spraying herbicide around the base of trees in the parks because it looks neat. And it's awful, and it's a battle with them because they just think they have to do it. It's a municipal sort of given. But if anything, I don't want to digress into that because that's another issue. Okay. But I did want to mention, you had your mowing sort of schedules where you sort of mowed until May and then you didn't mow it. You were saying no mow in June and July, and everyone here is now all this no mow May, and you're saying actually it's no mow June.
Well, no mow May means, and that's our Plantlife campaign. That means that you give things a decent start, and we do need to delay that for where you are in terms of latitude, of course. So no mow first half of June equivalent. What I was showing there with that tighter window of just 12 weeks, which was no mow June and July, was potentially a system where we were harvesting biomass from low value verges, but still enjoying the benefits of a flowering lawn. But also the exercise would pay for itself through the biomass harvesting collection, where we want to maintain a better habitat on road verges through more optimal management, targeted at those gold and silver medal winners, if you like, in terms of quality. Then the Plantlife guidance is better, is a better standard to go to. So yes, if you're striking a compromise between business viability of maintaining a verge system in a way that funds itself and delivers for biodiversity, then that's the kind of the no-mow June and July with 2 productive biomass harvests. But that shouldn't be where you have the best wildlife, and it should only act as the kind of next best connector between the best. Yeah.
And the problem for most gardeners is that if they don't mow it in May, by the time June or early June comes, it's too bloody long, and they've got to get a strimmer out. And I hate strimmers.
Yes.
I tend to go, oh God, I can't be bothered. I can't be bothered to go strimming it. I'm just going to have to cut it.
That's a good challenge. There are different ways to tackle it. Yes, you can use a strimmer. use the right personal protective equipment, but they are a chore. I've learned how to use an Austrian scythe. Great fun for a small plot. It's great. You can still hear the birds while you use it. But one really good way to do it is if you don't have a mulching mower, but if you do have a mower that can raise its blades, go up to the top setting and only mow half a width at once. Taking the load off the engine, you'll find that you can munch through it, provided it's not wet weather. A good, robust mower with an adjustable blade height. Take that blade height right up for the first pass, only mow half its width, and then you'll find you're collecting that first pass, then come back and do the next and the next and the next, again with a high setting, half width, and then make a final pass on the lower setting to neaten up. And it might sound like a real palaver, but don't forget, you've only done it once rather than perhaps 4, 5, 6 times in a year. So yeah, it's doable with the existing kit that you might have.
Okay. Be good to get more guidance out to gardeners, because I think that we just need to go and cut the grass because it looks ragged, and then so we've I know it's diverged away from verges, but mowing lawn seems to be it's a sort of flavour of the month at the moment. So it'd be good to get more help. Okay, right. Thanks very much. I don't know if anybody else has got any questions. That was me wrapping my bit up anyway.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mark, and hopefully a few more folk will get to see the recording.
We'll certainly make it very, very available. I think it's been an excellent evening.
Great.
Really thank you for coming to talk to us. I know there's only a few of us. You are competing with a Scottish football match.
Oh, no. Sorry about that. Of course
I wasn't known at the time when it was arranged, so it's just these things happen.
Of course I am.
Yeah. So I will get this circulated. Fiona will circulate through the NHT mailing lists and make sure that people have a link to it.
Great.
Look at it again.
I've really enjoyed researching, your local natural history.
Yes, and it was good to get that endorsement of it, because I mean it's sort of, and I can certainly in my notes to the trustees and other people, we can publicise we've got this talk, and it's given a critique of that, because we had, as you did mention, we've had some sort of issues with local landowners about rattle in particular, and
sure. So that's to be respected, of course. Yeah,
absolutely, yes. But we just, but it's good to have professional ecologists like yourself sort of saying what we've done and it's fine and blah blah. It's good to have that sort of background. It's not just one person on Isla's view. It's been endorsed by and looked at by other professionals as well. So that's good. I know you did admit it wasn't a full peer review, but it's as good a peer review as I've seen of many things.
Okay. No, it's my pleasure, and it's been really great to
enjoyed
with you tonight.
Your soil map was good, because where you had your hogweed and your fertility and your raised pH.
Maybe it's a theory. I mean, I guess you got the data.
So that's where the limestone is.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So it was all good tie-in. So.
Great.
Okay.
Very good. Thanks, Dave, for hosting. And,
thank you.
And thank
the Geological Society of Glasgow. They don't know they've hosted it, but they did.
Okay.
Okay, everyone else, thank you for joining in, and we'll let you know when we get a next talk and speaker on the go. Okay.
Lovely. All the best to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mark.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Fiona.
Right.
See you later.
All right. Thanks,
Cheerio.
Dave. See you.
Bye-bye.
Right. I might see you tomorrow at this meeting with Sally, Dave.
Yeah, is that tomorrow morning?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit out of touch with the knotweed thing, so I'm happy for you to talk to her. I may have a grandchild to mind tomorrow morning, so excuse me if I dip out. But
That's
fine. It'd be quite good to have a chat to it with her and see what's.
Yeah, do, because I think it's obviously a growing issue. I mean, I was sitting at Port Ellen by the O turn there, and I saw knotweed growing. Just on the top of the beach there, the top end of the Port Ellen beach there, and it's obviously spreading.
It's right through Inma Vale, so
yeah,
it's a real problem there. But yeah, we'll get that wee project thing started.
Okay.
Okie dokie. Thank you.
Okay. Good night.